Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Malice and the Mitten. I'm Tracy Preston.
And I'm Christine Mulligan.
Christine, before we begin today's case, I want to give a very special listener recognition.
Okay, I love when we get to do that. Go for it.
Me too. Now, this story came to us from Jessica Elliott. And Jessica has not sent us just one case. Oh, no. This is actually one of 3 stories that she has brought to Malice in the Mitten.
Okay, well, that matters because when listeners send these cases in, it usually means someone's name has stayed with them.
Exactly. Jessica also brought us the Christine Free case, and there is still one more story from her that we will touch on another day. But today, Jessica brought us the name Sally Ann Chesebro.
So, thank you, Jessica.
Yes, thank you, Jessica, truly. Because sometimes this is how a story finds its way back into the light. Not through headlines, not through breaking news, but because someone remembered a name and said, please look at her.
Okay, wait a minute. Was Sally a child?
She was. Sally Ann Chesebro was 6 years old. And before we go any further, we do need to give a content warning.
And we do maybe need to not thank Jessica so much. You know how I hate stuff about kids.
Now I take it back.
Today's episode discusses the death of a child, which everyone that knows me knows I don't like talking about this. However, today's episode discusses the death of a child, allegations of child abuse, drowning, punishment, and courtroom testimony involving family violence. We will not be using graphic detail for shock value, but the subject matter is deeply upsetting. Please take care of yourself while listening.
And as always, we also want to be clear with our legal disclaimer. This episode is based on publicly available reporting, legal coverage, and source material available to us at the time of recording. We will distinguish between what was reported, what was alleged, what was testified to in court, and what resulted in a conviction. One person in this case was convicted. Another was charged and later found not guilty. We will be careful with that distinction throughout this episode.
That's important, especially in a case like this.
It is, because this story is not just about what happened in 1978. It is also about what took 26 years to be heard in a courtroom. It is about a child whose death was first explained one way and then, decades later, re-examined as something much darker. And at the center of it all is Sally. Not a headline, not a court file, not a case number. A 6-year-old little girl in Battle Creek, Michigan. Sally Ann Chesebro was born on December 27th, 1971. She died on March 9th, 1978. 6 years old. That is kindergarten age, 1st grade age, the age of missing front teeth and crooked handwriting, the age of favorite toys, bedtime routines, snow boots by the door, and tiny hands wrapped around crayons. In 1978, Battle Creek was not the Battle Creek of today. It was still a working Michigan city with factory shifts, neighborhood schools, corner stores, and families who knew each other by sight, even if they did not know what was happening behind closed doors. And that phrase matters in this case, behind closed doors. Because for years, the story of Sally's death began in a bathroom. The basic account, as later reported, was that Sally had been in the bathtub at her family's home. Family members said at the time that she was in the tub with a toy and had been left unattended for about 5 minutes. Then, according to that original explanation, Sally's 7-year-old sister, Nancy, found her. Child finding a child. That is one of the pieces of the story that is almost impossible to sit with. because Nancy was not an adult walking into an emergency with the ability to understand what she was seeing. Nancy was only 7 years old, barely older than Sally, still a child herself.
7 years old. That is still so very little. That is definitely not someone that should have been seeing a sight like that and having to carry something like that.
No, and yet Nancy's memory, Nancy's voice, and Nancy's later statements would become central to what happened in this case decades later. But in March of 1978, Sally was gone. And the first version of the story did not lead to an immediate murder conviction. It did not bring a courtroom answer. It did not bring the kind of resolution that tells the public, this is what happened. This is who was responsible. And this is how the system responded. Instead, Sally's death settled into the past. But it did not disappear. That is the thing about old cases. We sometimes talk about them like they are frozen in time, but that is not really true. They keep moving. They move inside families, inside surviving witnesses, inside detectives who cannot quite let them go. They move inside files that sit on shelves, waiting for someone to open the box again. And Sally's case was one of those files. For years, police reportedly suspected that Sally's death was not a simple bathtub accident. Later reporting stated that investigators believed Sally had actually died while being punished, held under cold water in the bathtub. That is the turn in this story. Not just that a child died, but that the explanation given in 1978 did not satisfy everyone who looked at the case. And yet, suspicion is not the same as proof. A feeling is not the same as evidence. And in the justice system, especially in a case involving a child, time can become both an obstacle and a pressure point. Memories change. Relationships change. Fear changes. People grow older. Children become adults. And sometimes the person who was too young or too afraid to speak in the beginning finds the strength to speak later.
Oh, so is that what happened here? Is that what you're going to tell me? Did Nancy grow up and start realizing that what happened was very, very wrong?
That appears to be a major part of why the case came back. Yes. Years after Sally's death, Nancy Spaulding, Sally's older sister, told investigators she believes Sally had been killed. According to legal reporting, that was part of what led Calhoun County investigators to reopen the case. And I want to pause there because that sentence may sound simple. Nancy told investigators, but there's nothing simple about that. To come forward years later about something that happened inside your own childhood home, involving your own family, involving the death of your little sister, that is not simple, and it is not easy. That is not just giving a statement. That is reopening the worst room of your life and walking back into it. In May of 2002, Calhoun County's newly formed cold case team began reviewing Sally's death. This is not just one detective looking at an old file alone. The team included people from the Battle Creek Police Department, the Calhoun County Sheriff's Office, the Michigan State Police, and the Calhoun County Prosecutor's Office. That matters because cold cases are rarely solved by one person having one lucky moment. They are usually solved by persistence, by rechecking old statements, by comparing what was said then to what is being said now, by asking whether an explanation that was accepted years ago still holds up under a fresh set of eyes. Sally's case became the first of roughly 40 unsolved crimes being reviewed by that cold case team. And very quickly, it was moving. In May of 2002, David Walton and Bonnie Van Dam were arrested on warrants charging them in Sally's death. Walton was Sally's biological father. Bonnie Van Dam was Sally's mother. At the time of the arrest, the case was more than 24 years old. More than 24 years after a 6-year-old girl died in a bathtub. The people once closest to her were taken into custody and brought before the court.
That was most likely not on anyone's bingo card. That seems like something that would have felt impossible to the people that were hoping for it to happen. Anybody who remembered Sally as a little girl. I mean, after all that time, how many people could have remembered Sally besides her sister? Really?
Well, I would hope her parents, right? Family members.
That did it.
Right. 24 years. But it also must have felt terrifying because an arrest is not the same as an answer. It is the beginning of a legal process, not the end of one. And in Sally's case, the legal process would not be simple. Both David Walton and Bonnie Van Dam were charged, but their outcomes were different. Bonnie Van Dam was found not guilty in December of 2003. That is a line we are going to be very careful with. She was charged, but she was acquitted. And in this show, we do not erase acquittals just because the facts of a case are emotionally difficult. We honor the legal record, even when the story is painful. David Lee Walton's case moved forward, however, and on January 13th, 2004, Walton was convicted of second-degree murder in Sally's death. According to testimony summarized in legal reporting, Sally was being punished when she died after being dunked in a bathtub filled with cold water. On January 22nd, 2004, Walton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. On January 22nd, 2004, Walton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 20 years. 26 years after Sally died, a courtroom finally said the word murder. But even that does not make the story feel finished, because Sally was still 6. Nancy was still 7 when she found her, and the years in between did not come back. That is where we begin today. Not with the conviction or the sentence, not even with the cold case team. We begin with a little girl named Sally Ann Chesebro, whose death was first explained as a terrible accident, but whose story would wait more than 2 decades before the truth was forced into the open. Because in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1978, a 6-year-old girl died in a bathtub. And for a very long time, the story people were told was not the whole story. And that first story matters because the first story in a death investigation can become powerful very quickly. It shapes what neighbors hear. It shapes what family members repeat. It shapes how authorities respond in those first critical hours. It can become the version people hold on to, even if the pieces of it do not feel right. In Sally's case, the first story was simple enough to understand and devastating enough that many people may not have wanted to question it too hard. A 6-year-old girl was in a bathtub. She had a toy. She was left alone for a few minutes. Her sister found her. It sounded like a tragedy, a terrible accident. The kind of thing that makes parents everywhere feel sick. Because every parent knows how fast something can go wrong with a child and water. One moment, one distraction, one brief absence. That is what made the story believable. But believable is not the same as true. And as the years would eventually show, not everyone accepted that explanation.
That's what scares me about cases like this. Because if something sounds possible, people stop asking questions. But at the same time, then I think about the tragedies that you hear about where they are genuinely tragic accidents. And then your heart goes out to the parents for losing a child. You know what I mean? So back then, anybody with empathy would have believed that story without knowing what happens behind closed doors.
Right, it's plausible, but here's what I keep thinking about. She was 6. She's not a baby. That's just what glares at me the whole time. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not like she couldn't sit herself up. It's not like she couldn't stand up. So.
Yeah. Have your kids never played a little bit rough in the tub? I mean, mine used to, I used to bathe them in a big garden tub, and they would like slide their butts from one side to the other and make tidal waves in my bathroom. And I used to go in there screaming if they would, because it was a porcelain tub. If they would have hit their head on the side of the tub, they would have knocked themselves out and been dead.
Right.
Like, I yell at my kids for that all the time.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? So you could, like, I didn't stand on top of them when they were 6 and 7, because who does that? Like you said, they're big enough to be in there by themselves at that age. So as a mom that has done that before and then ran into the bathroom because I hear sloshing and I know they're being idiots, you know what I mean? So you run in to yell at them. But so as a mom and with someone with empathy and compassion, immediately, if I heard of a neighbor that had a story like that, I wouldn't think nefariously. You know what I mean? I'd be like, oh my God, I'm devastated for them.
Right. Of course.
You know?
Mm-hmm. But as a police officer, I don't know.
Yeah, but there may have been other signs and symptoms on the body. You know what I mean?
Right.
And maybe by the time they got there, maybe the water was way too cold than it should be. You know what I mean? I don't know, because all that's relative. Because how do we know it was an ice cold bath? Because by the time they came when she was deceased, I could imagine a hot bath would be cold by then.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
I hear you. I'm listening.
It's all speculation on our part, really, because we don't know. And I don't have access to police reports, so I don't know. But that is one of the most painful parts of Sally's case. A bathtub accident is possible. Children can drown in small amounts of water. It can happen quickly. It can happen quietly. All that's true. But in Sally's case, later investigators believe something else had happened. They believed she had been punished. They believed cold water had been used against her. And according to later legal reporting, trial testimony would describe Sally dying after being dunked in a bathtub filled with cold water. That is not the same story as an unattended child in a tub. That is not a tragic accident. That is control, punishment, force, and a little girl with no real power to protect herself. But in 1978, whatever questions existed did not result in an immediate murder charge. There was no quick conviction, no courtroom full of testimony, no public accounting of how a 6-year-old child died in that bathroom. Instead, Sally's death became something her surviving sister had to live with. As I mentioned, Nancy was just 7, old enough to remember, too young to understand what adults might later demand from that memory. And that is where we must be careful, because child witnesses carry trauma differently. They may remember pieces, be afraid. They may know what happened without having the words to explain it. They may understand danger before they understand evidence. A child can know a house is unsafe long before the outside world is willing to say it out loud.
And if Nancy was the one who found Sally, that image never leaves. And also, if Nancy was her sister, so if they were being abused, Nancy was most likely also being abused.
Right, I can't see one child getting cold bathtub dunkings and another one didn't.
Right.
What a horrible thing to do. And of course, my nurse brain kicks in with cold water and what that does to you, right? And then, I don't know, just horrible. And when we talk about surviving siblings in true crime, we have to remember something. They are victims too. Nancy lost her little sister. She was a part of the original scene. And years later, she would be part of the reason this case came back. But before that happened, there were years of silence. Years where Sally's name was not in the headlines, where the legal system had not yet called her death a murder, where whatever happened in that bathroom remained behind a version of events that had been allowed to stand. That is one of the hardest truths about cold cases. They are not always cold because no one cares. Sometimes they're cold because the first explanation was accepted before the deeper questions could break through. Sometimes they're cold because witnesses were too young, because fear lives inside of families, because the people who knew the most are the least safe to speak. And sometimes they are cold because a child's death inside a home is treated like a private tragedy before it is treated like a possible crime. In Sally's case, the public record we have now tells us that police had suspected for years that she did not die the way the first story said she did. That phrase, suspected for years, should stop us because it means questions were there. It means something about the explanation did not sit right. It means the truth may have been waiting, not because there was nothing to see, but because there was not yet enough to prove. And proof matters. We say that often on Malice and the Mitten, but it is worth saying again here. Suspicion is not enough to convict someone. Rumors not enough. Emotion not enough. Even when the victim is a child. Even when the story is horrifying. But even when your gut says something is wrong, the system requires evidence and testimony and the ability to take what people believe happened and place it under oath, under questioning, and under the burden of proof. That is the way it's supposed to work. But for families, that can feel unbearable because the heart does not wait for admissible evidence. The heart wants someone to say her name now, someone to tell the truth now, and wants the world to understand that Sally was not just a sad accident in an old newspaper clipping. She was a little girl. She was here, and something happened to her.
I don't know why, but I keep thinking about the age difference. Sally was 6, Nancy was 7. They were both babies.
They were, and I think that is why we must keep coming back to that. Because it is easy, once the court part starts, for Sally to become the subject of legal language. Second-degree murder, cold case review, arrest warrants, trial testimony, sentencing. Those words are necessary. They tell us what the system did, but they can also create distance. And this case cannot be understood from a distance. Sally's life was not long enough for distance. She never got to grow into the person she might have been, never got to middle school, high school, her first job, a first apartment, a grown-up laugh that sounded different from her child laugh. She was 6. And whatever fear existed in that bathroom on March 9, 1978 belonged to a child. And that is why the first story matters. Because for more than 2 decades, the public answer was not the final answer. And when the case was finally reopened, it would not be because time had made Sally less important. It would be because time had done something else. It had carried the memory forward. And that memory lived, in part, with Nancy. By 2002, Nancy was no longer a 7-year-old girl standing in the aftermath of her sister's death. She was an adult. She had survived into a future Sally never got. And according to legal reporting, Nancy told investigators that she believed Sally had been killed. And that statement did not erase the years. It didn't bring Sally back, but it helped reopen a door that had been closed for far too long. In Calhoun County, a new cold case team was beginning its work. Their job was to look again at the case that had not been answered. The ones that had sat in files, the one that still had names attached to them, the ones where the official ending did not feel like an ending at all. Sally's case became one of the first. And when investigators opened that file again, they were not just looking at a bathtub death from 1978. They were looking at a child, a sister, a daughter, a little girl whose story had waited 24 years for someone to ask the question again. What really happened to Sally Ann Chesebro? That is the question that waited. It waited through the rest of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and it waited while Battle Creek changed, while people moved, children grew up, while old files sat in storage, while names faded from public memory. And after all that time, Sally was still 6 years old.
Yeah, and picking up that cold case must have been hard because they're looking at old decisions and old way of looking at the original scene in the first place that was made years ago.
And that can be uncomfortable because when a cold case team reopens the file, they are not only asking what happened, sometimes they're also asking what was missed. That does not always mean someone did something wrong. It does not always mean investigators failed. Cases can stall for many reasons. Evidence may not be available. Witnesses may not be ready. The science may not be where it is today. The law may require more than suspicion can provide. But in Sally's case, later reporting says police had suspected for years the original bathtub explanation was not the full truth. So when the cold case team came in, they were not starting from nothing. They were starting from a file that already carried doubt. And then came Nancy. Nancy was no longer that 7-year-old child connected to the earliest account of Sally's death. She was an adult. She had lived more than 2 decades with whatever she knew, whatever she remembered, whatever she feared, and whatever she believed about the day her little sister died. Nancy told investigators she believed Sally had been killed. And that statement mattered, not because one person's belief can convict anyone, because it can't, but because in a cold case, a surviving witness can become the key that makes investigators look at the old facts in a new way. Nancy's statement did not stand alone in a vacuum. It became part of a renewed investigation, part of a broader review, part of the process of taking an old explanation and asking whether it matched the evidence, the testimony, and the memories that had survived.
And I can't help but think about what brought her to that decision, to be able to say it out loud, to take herself to the investigators, what it took for her to do that, and what kind of, I don't know, my brain just wants to go be in her head at that moment, like what it must have took for her to say that out loud.
Yeah, me too. And I think we should be careful here because we do not know everything Nancy carried. We do not know every private moment. We don't know every reason why the case did not move sooner or why it had moved when it did. But we do know this. The case was reopened, her death was reviewed, and in May of 2002, more than 24 years after Sally died, 2 arrests were made. David Lee Walton and Bonnie Van Dam were arrested on warrants, charging them in Sally's death. Walton was identified in later legal reporting as Sally's biological father, and Bonnie Van Dam was her mother. And suddenly, a death that had once been explained as an accidental drowning inside a family home was no longer being treated that way by the justice system. It was now being treated as a homicide case. And that is an enormous shift. For decades, Sally's story had remained largely in shadows. Then in 2002, it moved back into public view with the kind of words that changed everything. Arrested, charged, cold case, murder. But even then, the truth was not automatic. An arrest does not tell the whole story. A charge does not prove guilt. And when the accused people are the child's own parents, the emotional weight becomes almost unbearable. Because now the case was not only about what happened in a bathroom in 1978, it was about whether a courtroom could reconstruct that moment after more than 24 years had passed. It was about whether memory could survive time, whether testimony could carry the weight of a child's death. And it was about whether the first story, the story of a child left alone in a bathtub, would finally be challenged in court.
But that's a long time. After 24 years, how are you going to prove something like that? How are you going to prove something after that long?
It's definitely a challenge, and that is why cold cases are so difficult. People sometimes hear that a case was reopened decades later and assume there must have been some single dramatic discovery, a hidden confession, a new forensic test, a box of evidence found in a basement. Now, sometimes that happens, but often cold cases move because investigators put pressure on the old story. They compare statements, find inconsistencies, speak to people who were once too scared, too young, or too dependent on the adults around them to say what they knew. They recognized that silence is not always the same as absence. And in Sally's case, we do not have every original article, every page of testimony, or every investigative report, so we're not going to pretend that we do. What we can say is the public reporting available to us points to a long-held suspicion by police, a cold case review in 2002, Nancy's later statement to investigators, and the arrest of David Walton and Bonnie Van Dam. That is the foundation, and that foundation would carry Sally's case into court. But before we get to the verdict, we must talk about what the courtroom was being asked to do. Because the court was not being asked to decide whether Sally's death was sad. Everyone knew it was sad. It was not being asked whether a 6-year-old dying in a bathtub was tragic. Of course it was. The court was being asked whether Sally's death was criminal, whether the first explanation was false, whether punishment had crossed into murder, and whether, after all those years, the state could prove who was responsible. That is where the story becomes legally complicated, because both David Walton and Bonnie Van Dam were charged, but only one of them would be convicted. And for Malice in the Mitten, that distinction matters deeply. We can hold compassion for Sally, recognize the horror of the allegations, and acknowledge the courtroom testimony that later led to Walton's conviction. But we must also honor the fact that Bonnie Van Dam was found not guilty. Not because the story's easier that way, because it feels emotionally satisfying, but because the truth matters more. And the legal truth is part of the truth. So as we move into the court cases, we are going to be precise. We're going to be careful. We're going to say what was alleged. We are going to say what was testified to, what was proven in a jury, and we are going to say what was not. Because Sally's story deserves that discipline. A child's death does not need exaggeration to matter. It already matters. The facts are already heavy enough. In 2002, the question had waited for 24 years and finally being carried into the legal system. Did Sally Ann Chesebro die because of an accident? Or did she die because someone with power over her used punishment as cruelty and cruelty as control? That question would now have to be answered in court. But in court, stories do not move the way they move in grief. They move through charges, hearings, witness testimony, cross-examination, jury instructions, the burden of proof. And in Sally's case, the courtroom would not deliver one simple answer for everyone who was charged. It would divide the case in two. Bonnie Van Dam, Sally's mother, was charged in connection with her death, but in December of 2003, she was found not guilty. And that is where we need to stop and be very clear. A not guilty verdict is not a footnote. It is not something we slide past because the rest of the story is painful. Bonnie was charged. She was acquitted. And that means the state did not prove its case against her beyond a reasonable doubt.
Even when the case itself is heartbreaking and everybody has their opinions, when push comes to shove, it's also possible that she was a victim also, which is why she wasn't convicted. Just saying, statistically, in my opinion, statistically, in 1978, if there was a dad that was a little more brutal than not, the mom was not likely to also be brutal, if you know what I'm saying.
That's right. That's a very good point, Christine, right? Abusive,
Yeah.
Not only to, little children, but...
So to his wife.
Right.
I'm going to be real optimistic right now and say, hopefully the court's got it right, you know?
Right. David Lee Walton's case ended differently. His case went before a jury, and in January of 2004, that jury convicted him of second-degree murder. And that is still a serious conviction. It means the jury found that Sally's death was not an accident. It means the jury believed the state had proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Walton was criminally responsible for her death. And according to legal coverage of the case, testimony at Walton's trial described Sally being punished when she died after being dunked in a bathtub full of cold water. And And that sentence is hard to say. It should be hard to hear. Because the courtroom was no longer dealing with the first story, the story of a child left briefly unattended in a bathtub. It was now dealing with a very different version of events. Punishment, cold water, a child being dunked, a child who did not survive.
And of course, that changes everything. That changes the whole sentimentality to the stories, because that means that the bathtub was not just where she died. It was part of what was done to her.
And that is the brutal shift in this case. The bathtub had been part of the original explanation, but in that version, it was almost passive. A location, a terrible setting, a place where something tragic happened. But the courtroom testimony describes something active, something imposed, something done to a child as punishment. And when we talk about punishment in cases of child abuse, we must be careful. Because discipline is not what we are talking about here. Discipline teaches. It protects. It's supposed to come from care, boundaries, and love. Punishment that terrorizes a child is not discipline. Punishment that uses fear is not discipline. Punishment that places a child's body in danger, that's not discipline. And punishment that ends in death is not discipline. It's harm. And in Sally's case, the jury heard the evidence, heard the testimony, and convicted David Lee Walton of second-degree murder, 20 years before even the possibility of parole. But Sally had already been gone for nearly 26 years at this point, and that is one of those pieces of justice that never balances. The sentence matters, the conviction matters. A courtroom can finally correct a public record, but it cannot rewind the years when the truth sat unanswered. It cannot give Nancy back the childhood she had before she found her sister. It cannot give Sally a 7th birthday.
That's a painful sentence. A 7th birthday.
Because Sally's entire life fits inside 6 years. And when you really think about that, the courtroom language starts to feel too small. Conviction, sentence, parole. There are victories, yes, they matter. They tell the world that time does not automatically erase accountability. They tell families that even old cases can still move. They tell investigators that reopening a file can change history. But they also expose how long the unanswered years were. For Sally, justice did not come quickly. It came after Nancy grew up. It came after the first story had sat in place for decades.
Legally, the truth is clear in one way. However, emotionally, there are still so many unanswered pieces.
And I think that's why Sally's case stays with us. Because it is not only a story about a cold case team doing its job, even though that matters greatly, and I'm thankful for it. It is not only a story about a surviving sister speaking up, even though that matters deeply. It is not a story about a conviction after decades of waiting, even though that matters too. It is a story about how fragile a child is when the danger is inside the home, how hard it can be for the outside world to see what happens behind closed doors, and how long the truth can remain buried beneath the first explanation people are given. In 1978, Sally's death was explained as a bathtub tragedy. In 2004, a jury said it was murder. Between those two versions were 26 years. 26 years of waiting, of memory, of a little girl's name sitting inside a file until someone opened it again. And that is where we need to look next. Not only at the verdict or the sentence, but at the person whose memory helped bring Sally's case back into the light. Nancy, the sister who was there, the child who grew up, the witness who carried a truth no 7-year-old should ever have to carry.
I honestly can't even imagine that. A 7-year-old finding her little sister like that, first and foremost. And then, if everything is as she remembers it to now be, looking back, all of the self-questioning as you're growing up, as she, I assume, did up until she's 27 years old by the time she comes forward. I just want to dive into her psyche. Again, I can't help but think about being in her brain. That's a lot.
Right, and I also think of the fear. I mean, let alone the severe trauma she went through. I would imagine as a little girl, like if she had these feelings all along, how frightened she must have been her entire life.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. But you never know. Trauma sits with people completely different. She could have lived her whole life just thinking that was normal life for everybody and not really thinking of it as abuse, not thinking of it as punishment, right? She could have thought that was normal and not even given it a second thought when she was a kid. But then as she grew up and realized and processed and then went to investigators about it and said, hey, they murdered my sister. I have so many questions just about Nancy. And, that's just me geeking out on the psych of it all.
Right. Sally was a little girl born just 2 days after Christmas in 1971. A little girl who should have turned 7 in December of 1978. A little girl buried in Bedford Cemetery. A little girl whose sister remembered. And when we close this story, that is where we need to return. Not to the cold water or to the courtroom, but to Sally Ann Chesebro, the child at the center of a truth that waited 26 years to be spoken out loud. Because that is who this episode belongs to. Sally was not forgotten, not by Nancy, not by the investigators who reopened the file, not by the cold case team that looked at what had been left behind, and now, not by Jessica Elliott, who sent Sally's story to us. So Jessica, thank you for remembering that stories like Sally's still matter. And thank you for trusting Malice and the Mitten to bring the story back into the light. I want our listeners to understand something. When you send us these names, when you send us these cases, you are not just giving us episode ideas. You are helping make sure people are remembered. You are saying, this person mattered. This story mattered, and the truth should not stay buried. So today we remember Sally, not for the way she died, but for the truth that finally caught up to the lie. For Nancy, who carried what no child should have to carry. For every investigator who looked again. For every listener who sends a name and says, please, don't let this one be forgotten. And for Sally Ann Chesebro, a little girl from Battle Creek, 6 years old, forever.
I'm Christine Mulligan.
And I'm Tracy Preston.
And this is Malice in the Mitten.
Where the story matters,
but the truth matters more.
So thank you all for listening every week. We really appreciate you. And if you know of a story that deserves to be brought back into the light, please send us an email at maliceinthemitten@gmail.com. Show us that you like what we're doing here on Malice by leaving a positive comment, give a 5-star rating, like, subscribe, and share our podcast with your true crime loving friends. Have a great week, everyone, and we will see you all back right here on Friday for F-Bomb. Have a great week, everyone.
Smash all them likes and hearts and stars. Bye.
Bye.